Okay, this week we're talking about terror from above, which, as I mentioned a couple of weeks ago, there's two forms of terror from above. There's state terror and state-sponsored terrorism. And we'll begin with a discussion of state terror, but the primary emphasis will be on state-sponsored terrorism, since that is really more important to understand for other portions of the semester. And depending on your definition, some would argue that state terror doesn't even qualify as terrorism. So I'm just going to briefly walk through the differences between the two so that there's some clarity there, especially in case there's any confusion right now. So state terror is the use of terrorist tactics by a government against its own population. And the most commonly cited examples of this are the Holocaust under the Nazis and the purges under Stalin. But there's other examples that are less well known, like the death squads that operated in parts of Latin America during the 1970s and 1980s, and to some extent even right-wing groups that operated in Europe. So let's briefly talk about each of these examples of state terror, and then we'll move into state-sponsored terrorism. So like I said, one of the most well-known examples is Nazi Germany. Nazi violence against their own population, primarily the Jews, but also blacks, mentally ill, the elderly, included things like intimidation, firing squads, mass arrests, and eventually concentration camps. And it's estimated that about 4 million people died in extermination camps alone, about 80 to 90% of whom were Jews. The Holocaust alone was responsible for about 6 million Jewish deaths. Now, we can't call all of that state terror because a lot of the exterminations were done outside of Germany, and so that might fall more into the category of war crimes. But what went on within Germany itself could be considered state terror, because it's not a war crime to engage in violence against your own population, but it does fit the definition of state terror. The Nazis eventually used these same tactics against Poles, Serbs, Russian POWs, as many as 3 million of whom were killed. And so the total number of dead under the Nazi regime was between 9 and 11 million. But a good percentage of that were German citizens, and therefore that part qualifies as state terror. Another example, which is less well known to some degree, but actually caused even more deaths, was the purges under Stalin. Roughly 20 million Soviet citizens died during the purges. Between 1936 and 1938, there were public trials held of government officials who were accused of conspiring with the West and to assassinate Stalin and restore capitalism in Russia, or in the Soviet Union, more accurately. In 1937, Stalin gave the order to liquidate all kulak helpers and ex-kulaks. These were basically Ukrainian peasants who had resisted collectivization. The Red Army itself was also purged, removing 3 out of the 5 marshals, the highest ranking officers, 13 out of 15 commanders, and 8 out of 9 admirals. In total, about 30,000 in the armed forces were executed under Stalin's orders because basically of his paranoia of enemies. There were also military operations throughout the country between 1937 and 1940 to destroy what was believed to be a German fifth column, basically sympathizers with Germany who were opposed to Stalin. Those are the two biggest examples in terms of numbers of death at the hands of government. But there are a couple others that in some ways fit the description of terrorism more because it's less directly involving the state, but they're also less well known, and we're talking about fewer numbers of people. But nevertheless, I want to spend some time talking about those. And where we see this pretty heavily is in the 1970s and in the 1980s, so at kind of the peak of the Cold War. Some operated earlier in the 1960s, but the 70s and 80s really is where we see a lot of this. And primarily we see it in Europe and in Latin America. And it was largely used by conservative governments or right-wing governments, or in some cases military dictatorships, against those who were perceived to be a threat to the government, in many cases under the guise of anti-communism, so that the United States would either actively support the government or at least turn a blind eye. And so if we sort of compare state terror or violence by the state in Europe with that in Latin America, there is a difference. In Europe, a good deal of the violence was carried out by democratic states and was aimed at national separatist groups. Now, some of these had Marxist leanings, and so it was easy to justify in terms of anti-communism, but it was primarily targeted against national separatist groups. In Latin America, on the other hand, many of the governments were controlled by military dictatorships, and violence was primarily aimed at those who the government claimed were trying to overthrow the state. Basically, anybody the government that the government saw as a threat. And it's unclear to the extent to which a threat really existed in all these cases, or was it just opponents of the government? So if we look first at Europe during the Cold War, the most common examples of these kind of right-wing groups that were at least connected to the government, if not directly operated by the government. In many cases, they were organized by military and police with the tacit support of the government. And so the GAL and the BVE in Spain were both right-wing groups that targeted Basques, that were trying to prevent the Basques from declaring independence, and would often target ETA, which was a Basque separatist group. Also around the same time, in much the same way, you have several groups operating in Northern Ireland that are considered loyalists, those who were loyal to England and wanted to keep Northern Ireland as a part of England, and therefore saw the IRA and all of its variants as a threat. The Ulster Defence Association, Ulster Volunteer Force, and the Red Hand Commandos are a couple examples of right-wing loyalist groups. And like I said, many of these groups were not directly run by the government the way they were in many Latin American countries. But the governments certainly knew about them and did much less to stop them than they could have. And so if we sort of jump ahead to Byman's classifications of state sponsorship, this may not be the most active form of support that the government was giving to these groups, but because the government knew about them and didn't do anything about them and sort of aligned with them ideologically, we can consider this a form of state terror. Now, comparing that to Latin America, what we see again is that a lot of these governments had military dictatorships and saw threats everywhere, including from communist states. And so we see these kinds of right-wing groups, whereas in Latin America we tend to label them as death squads. We see them in Argentina, Brazil, Chile, Colombia, Dominican Republic, El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras. And the names there in parentheses are sort of the known groups. El Salvador and Guatemala, it was much less organized. But probably the most well-known of all of these death squads was in Argentina with the Argentine Anti-Communist Alliance, or the AAA. Again, many of these are basically paramilitary groups that were directly connected to the state, which in most cases were military dictatorships at one time or another. And groups that weren't directly connected to the state at least had a direct connection to the police or the military, and probably operated with the government turning a blind eye. Now, Argentina is a particularly brutal case. It's often referred to as the Dirty War, and there were about 30,000 people who disappeared in Argentina between 1976 and 1983. Again, about 30,000. And they're referred to as the disappeared, or los desaparecidos. Most of them were secretly arrested and in the middle of the night taken away and murdered by the military government as part of this dirty war. Many were taken by the death squads like the AAA, who were bands of off-duty police and military for the most part. The AAA itself was formed by Argentina's deputy chief of the federal police, and at least nominally it was designed to counter left-wing terrorism, but it eventually participated in the dirty war and helped to disappear many of the 30,000. Many of the victims will never be found because they were cut open and thrown out of airplanes over the Atlantic, and so basically given to the sharks to eat. Others were held in detention centers, probably buried in the middle of jungles or somewhere where it would be very difficult to find them. One of the things that I think is useful about bringing up these cases, even if you don't see state terror as a form of terrorism, is that just as there is a blurry line between terrorism and guerrilla warfare, there's also a blurry line between state terror and legitimate counterterrorism. When does obviously, if there's a real threat to the state, then actions that are against that particular threat would qualify as counterterrorism, whereas threats that are made up simply for the state to establish control would qualify as state terror. But even if the threat is real, the state can go too far and venture into state terror. And so one of the things maybe we could discuss as a class on D2L is, when do states cross that line? Assuming there is a legitimate threat to the state, at what point does counterterrorism cross over into state terror? Now, Claridge defines state terrorism basically the same way he would define terrorism, except the state is the actor. As I've mentioned before, I don't particularly buy the arguments or include in my definition the role of a state as a terrorist. Certainly it can engage in terroristic acts just like everybody else and is much more responsible for death and destruction than any single terrorist group. But that doesn't necessarily put it in the same category as terrorism. Where these two kind of cross, where you get a mix of state involvement and conventional terrorism or insurgent terrorism, is in the area of state sponsorship. And this is another form of terrorism from above that involves the government. And Daniel Byman, whose book you read for this week, defines state sponsorship as a government's intentional assistance to a terrorist group to help it use violence, bolster its political activities, or sustain the organization. Now, of course, in order to claim that a state is sponsoring terrorism, you first have to accept that the group it sponsors fits the definition of a terrorist organization. So, for instance, if you don't believe that Hezbollah is a terrorist organization, then Iranian sponsorship to Hezbollah would not qualify as sponsoring terrorism. Or if you're Irish Catholic and don't see the IRA as a terrorist group, then support from U.S. citizens would not qualify as sponsorship, meaning the U.S. would not be a passive sponsor, despite Byman's assertion. So even though many people would agree that the states that Byman talks about are in fact sponsoring terrorism, because there's no agreement on the definition of terrorism, there could be some who disagree with some of his classifications. But I'm going to go through Byman's book primarily for the rest of this presentation. If you've already read the book, a lot of this is just going to be sort of review. So I don't think there's anything... well, I will also be talking about the State Department report. So I was going to say I don't think there's anything else that I'm going to be talking about if you've read the Byman book. But I will get into the State Department report a little bit as well. So first, let's talk about the different types of sponsors that Byman discusses. Now, he has 6 different categories of state sponsors. The first category are what he calls the strong supporters. And these are states that have a very high level of commitment to a terrorist group or groups and are also able to offer significant resources. And probably the best example is Iran's support for Hezbollah, which includes financial support, arms, training, providing sanction, diplomatic support, basically all of the different elements of state sponsorship. And that's an example of strong supporters. You've also got weak supporters, and these are states that may have a high level of commitment to the group, but don't have a lot of resources to provide to the group. So for example, the Taliban in Afghanistan, its support for Al-Qaeda would fit into this. Al-Qaeda actually had more resources than the Taliban did. So their support was essentially providing a safe haven, a place for the training camps, and to some extent an ideological base. Third are the lukewarm supporters. And this is when, according to Byman, a government or a regime favors a terrorist cause but offers little direct support. I think he cites Iran's ties to radical Shia groups in the Persian Gulf, in which they have kind of a common ideology, common beliefs, but Iran really doesn't do a whole lot to advance their cause. And then you've also got antagonistic supporters. And this is a case where a state will actually provide support to a terrorist group in order to try to control the group, or even in some cases weaken the group. And Syria's relationship with Palestinian groups is an example of this. It provides support to Palestinian groups, but is not ideologically or politically in line with those Palestinian groups, and generally provides support in an attempt to control or undermine some of the Palestinian authorities. So these first four types of sponsors are examples of what Byman calls active sponsorship. And the differences between the four really have to do with degree of enthusiasm and capability of the states. And we could debate whether these categories are useful or not. I think there's an important distinction here, but in some ways it's just as useful to talk about all of these examples as simply active state sponsors of terrorism. But Byman also talks about two other categories of sponsorship, one being passive supporters. And this, he argues, is a type of support that's often overlooked when we talk about terrorism and state sponsorship. And so really this is the primary contribution of Byman's book. And what he argues is these are states that turn a blind eye to terrorist activities. They may not agree with the terrorist groups, they may not provide any direct support to them, but they allow the groups to be active within the country. So for example, Saudi Arabia ignoring fundraising and recruitment that was going on within the Saudi kingdom in order to support groups like Al-Qaeda. Also within this group would be, for example, the United States turning a blind eye to Irish Catholic support to the IRA and the PIRA. And then finally, Byman talks about unwilling hosts. And these are states that, again, are not active sponsors of terrorism, but often are failed states or very weak states that are simply unable to remove terrorist groups from their territory. Somalia and Lebanon are examples of this, Lebanon being unable to expel Hezbollah. Sudan, to some extent, when Al-Qaeda was based there, might fit into this category, especially once the Sudanese government realized that it was facing a threat from the United States by continuing to sponsor Al-Qaeda. They tried to get rid of Al-Qaeda and had some trouble doing that. This last category really is less about sponsoring terrorism, and it's more about states that are victims of terrorists because they're too weak to remove them from their soil. And so I think that is an important category, because it's easy to lump all governments that harbor terrorist groups into the category of active sponsors, but some of them just may not have the ability to remove the groups from their territory. And so that might be an opportunity for the international community to do something. And so I just think that's a useful distinction to make. Now, sponsorship can take a number of different forms. States can sponsor groups in a number of different ways, any of which of them can get the state placed on the U.S. list of state sponsors of terrorism. One of the first ways of sponsoring a group is probably the most common form, is to provide training and operations, basically to give the group basic knowledge in how to fire a gun up to the design of explosives. It could also include providing information to the group, such as that Iran and Syria provide to Hezbollah in order to assist in its attacks against the United States in 1983. Other forms of sponsorship, money, arms, logistics, basically providing small arms or other weapons to the terrorist group. Libya gave the Provisional IRA $3.5 million in the 1970s to buy arms and explosives, and also gave them tons of arms in the 1980s. And things like that made Libya one of the primary state sponsors of terrorism in the 70s and 80s. Money also, in addition to um, allowing a group to purchase more arms and explosives, can also help in the training of a group. Groups typically don't have day jobs, and they don't want to have to worry about their finances. And so money can help groups spend more time in training. It can help them with recruitment, particularly when groups are competing with one another for a finite number of recruits. The group that has more money is more likely to get more recruits or better recruits. States can also, in this category, provide terrorist passports or help fund front companies as ways of helping the group logistically. So those all sort of fall into this category. Diplomatic backing is another way of sponsoring a terrorist group, and this is basically where a state uses its influence to endorse a group or its cause. And in doing so, it can legitimize a group, which again helps attract recruits and additional money. For example, because of support from several Arab states, by the end of the 1970s, the Palestine Liberation Organization, the PLO, had diplomatic relations with more states than did the State of Israel, even though the PLO was a terrorist organization. Even backing the political wing of a group, of a terrorist group, provides some legitimacy to at least the cause, if not the terrorist methods. And so that's often a common form of state sponsorship that often doesn't become public or doesn't get a state put on a list of sponsoring. States can also provide organizational assistance to terrorist groups. They can use their resources and expertise to help found a new group, particularly when members are inexperienced in how to develop a terrorist organization. The state can help with recruiting. One important thing to keep in mind is that over 90% of terrorist groups don't survive their first year. And having a state sponsor can vastly improve a group's chance of having endurance beyond that first year. States can also help to unify groups that would otherwise be rivals and bring them together under a common organization. Iran actually, this is what Iran did in helping to create Hezbollah, which emerged out of several Lebanese Shia factions. And Iran's involvement helped to create a larger Hezbollah organization and helped it to endure. States might also guide a group directly, offering it kind of an ideological blueprint from which to operate. For example, Pakistan sought to guide Kashmiri groups away from pure Kashmiri nationalism into more of an Islamic radicalism. And what that did is it emphasized Pakistan's rightful control over Kashmir rather than Kashmir as an independent state. State revolutions can also inspire terrorist groups. Castro's revolution in Cuba led to the creation of several Latin American terrorist groups that were attempting to apply the Cuban model to their own state. And again, this is another form of sponsorship that often gets overlooked because it's not directly providing money or arms to a terrorist group, but that kind of ideological base can be really important for a group to gain momentum. And then finally, what I would argue is maybe one of the most important forms of state sponsorship is providing a safe haven or sanctuary to a group. Iran, for example, gave Iraqi Shiites a place to organize and plan, which would have been impossible under Iraq or in Iraq under Saddam Hussein. Likewise, turnabout's fair play. Iraq gave the Mujahideen-e-Khalq, the MEK, a safe haven and a place to train for attacks against Iran. The MEK is a group of Iranian opponents of the religious state that are at least rhetorically trying to bring about democracy in Iran. But because they were also enemies of the Iranian state, Saddam Hussein gave them a safe haven from which to launch attacks into Iran. A similar type of sponsorship is the right of transit, basically allowing groups to move through your country or to receive aid from another country through your borders. For example, Syria allows Iran to funnel aid to Hezbollah by doing it through Syria, from Syria into Lebanon. And so that's not exactly providing sanctuary to the group, but it certainly is sort of along the same lines. There's a number of different reasons why states will provide support to a terrorist group. Byman talks about 3 broad categories of sponsorship or reasons of sponsorship, each of which has several specific goals or subcategories. So for example, one goal of sponsorship Byman labels strategic concerns, and this includes a number of different goals or reasons. You may want to destabilize or weaken a neighbor. For example, Iraq's support of the MEK against Iran was intended to destabilize or weaken the Iranian government. It may also be about projecting power. For example, Libya's support for Abu Nidal. It may be about changing regime. Iran's support for the Islamic Front for the Liberation of Bahrain fits that example. Or it could also be about shaping opposition. India's support for rivals of the Jammu and Kashmir Liberation Front was a strategic concern that the JKLF would come to power and push for independence, and by supporting the rival group, India was actually hoping to better shape the situation. Ideology is another goal, either enhancing the international prestige of a terrorist group, for example, Egypt's support for the Palestinian movements. And this is important because in that particular case, the Egyptian government had very little respect for the Palestinian groups, but because Egypt wanted to maintain leadership in the Arab world, it was essentially forced to support Palestinian movements, at least ideologically. Also within this category would be attempts to export a political system. Again, Iran's support for Shia groups in Iraq was directly an attempt to bring about an Iranian-style religious regime in Iraq. And then there's also domestic political reasons for sponsorship. It may be about supporting an ethnic or a religious kin group, for example, Pakistan's support for Kashmiri militants. It could also be about providing military or operational aid to an organization. So for example, the Taliban's cooperation with Al-Qaeda was, at least in part, a domestic political decision by the Taliban. States might also use sponsorship as a source of restraint, and I touched on this a little bit on the last slide, as a way of supporting or controlling a terrorist group through sponsorship. The groups really who are considering state sponsorship have to weigh the pros and cons of gaining more resources and being able to focus more on the terrorism, but at the same time losing some of their autonomy. When you have a state sponsor, a terrorist group is not always able to do everything it would want to do. Some believe that Soviet sponsorship of Marxist-Leninist groups in some ways restrained terrorism and controlled it, prevented it from getting too out of control for fear that the United States would retaliate. And that, that explains why with the post-Cold War world, terrorism became more deadly. That sponsor was no longer there to restrain it, that the primary sponsors now, Iran, Syria, weren't restraining violence the way the Soviet Union had. I'm not sure I buy that argument, but certainly there's an element of control that a state sponsor does have over a group, especially if the group is heavily dependent on the funds or the arms or the training that it gets from the terrorist group. Now, I mentioned that I would talk a little bit about the State Department reports and sort of bring that together with the Byman book. And if we focus on active sponsors primarily, because these are the ones who are really providing the most support and aid to terrorist organizations. Every year, the Department of State puts out a list of states that sponsor terrorism. And in the last couple of reports, there have been 4 states that were listed. States that are put on this list are automatically sanctioned from the United States economically and diplomatically. And what that means is that there's a ban on arms-related exports and sales to that country. There's prohibitions on economic assistance. U.S. will oppose loans by international financial institutions like the World Bank and the IMF. And there will also be basically the U.S. will lift diplomatic immunity held by those countries in order to allow civil lawsuits in U.S. courts against the countries because of their involvement in terrorism. So it's important to understand that this is a list that is put out by the State Department. And so we need to recognize that it's a political list, not only because of who writes the report, but also because the United States would not want to put states on the list if it's unwilling to sever ties in those ways. So a state that might be sponsoring terrorism, but that is an important trade partner of the United States, is much less likely to be put on this list. Now, that may be a cynical way of looking at it, but I think it's actually kind of a realistic way of looking at it. And I'll talk about a couple of cases where that's been the situation. Anyway, the four current active sponsors, according to the State Department, are Iran, who has been on this list since 1984, and it's currently the most active sponsor. Government agencies directly support Palestinian groups with funding, training, and weapons, and this includes Lebanese Hezbollah, Hamas, Palestinian Islamic Jihad, Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine. And Iran has also, since 9/11, has detained senior al-Qaeda members, but refuses to either bring them to justice or transfer custody. And so that's kind of a sticky point with the United States right now. Second is Syria, which has been on this list even longer than Iran. It's been on the State Department list since 1979. And it's on the list primarily because it provides political and material support to Hezbollah, as well as political support to Palestinian groups like Palestinian Islamic Jihad, Hamas, and the PFLP. It, for example, allows groups to establish headquarters in the capital city of Damascus. Now, the report does say, I believe, that Syria has not directly been implicated in an act of terrorism since 1986. So almost 2 decades since it's been directly involved or at least implicated in an attack. But because of the support that it provides to groups, it's still listed by the State Department. Cuba has been on this list since 1982. And primarily it's on this list because, and this is where the politics comes into play, it's primarily on this list because it justifies continued use of sanctions against Cuba. Now, what the State Department will say is that Cuba has refused to undertake certain counterterrorism efforts. It continues to provide a safe haven for members of ETA, FARC, also the ELN, and that it maintains relations with other state sponsors like Iran. Also, Cuba will not satisfy U.S. extradition requests for those terrorists that it harbors in the country. The fourth and final state on this list is Sudan, who's been on the list since 1993. It was originally on the list because it provided a safe haven to bin Laden before he moved to Afghanistan, and also provided support to Palestinian terrorist groups. It does still support Hamas and welcomed to Sudan as part of the Palestinian Authority, but has been a strong partner in the war on terror, pursuing terrorist operations that threaten U.S. interests and personnel in Sudan, and was really close to being taken off this list until the crisis in Darfur occurred. And that's one of the main reasons that it continues to be on the list. Now, I think also just as interesting as the states that are on the list, there's several states that are not on this list, or that were on the list and no longer are there. 3 states in particular were on this list until fairly recently. Iraq was on the list initially from 1979 until 1982, and then again from 1990 until the fall of the Saddam Hussein regime, at which point the State Department took Iraq off this list. I think it was September 2004, so that the United States could renew trade with the new Iraqi government. Libya, which was added to the list in 1979, was removed in May of 2006, in large part because of the many steps it took to get off the list. It gave up its weapons of mass destruction program. It made reparations for the bombing of Pan Am Flight 103, and it also signed all of the international conventions against terrorism. North Korea was added to the list in 1988, and it's not known to have sponsored any acts since 1987. It does still harbor 4 Japanese Red Army members who hijacked a plane in 1970. However, the U.S. began the process of removing North Korea from this list in February of 2007 as part of negotiations over stopping North Korea's nuclear program. So North Korea, again, like Cuba, was on this list largely for political reasons and was removed from the list not because it stopped doing terrorism, but because it promised to give up its weapons of mass destruction program, or specifically its nuclear program. It was removed from the list in October of 2008, but the U.S. is still kind of considering reinstating North Korea because it has failed to cooperate with the U.S. on terrorism and because it continues to make progress in its nuclear program. South Yemen was also on the list from 1979 to 1990, largely for supporting several left-wing terrorist groups during the Cold War, but it was taken off the list when it merged with North Yemen. Despite the fact that Afghanistan under the Taliban provided immense support for bin Laden and al-Qaeda prior to 9/11, it was never placed on the State Department list. And a lot of people sort of question that, and the answer is actually really simple. It's just not always, it's just not clear. The main reason is that the United States never recognized the Taliban as a legitimate government. And so because it was never recognized as the government, it could not be identified as a state sponsor of terrorism. The U.S. never recognized it as a state under the Taliban regime, and so it could not be a state sponsor of terrorism. At least as far as the State Department was concerned. You would first have to recognize the government in order for it to be a state sponsor. And so that's this plain and simple reason that Afghanistan was not on this list at any point. Finally, sort of most recently, some people argue that Venezuela should be put on the list because, again, the politics, partly because it has a communist government and is hostile to the United States, at least U.S. interests. But it also has been known to support terrorist groups in Latin America, particularly those operating against the Colombian government, which it sees as a puppet of the United States. FARC in particular has been receiving support from the Venezuelan government, presumably with Chavez's knowledge. Now, keep in mind, there are ramifications of putting Venezuela on the list. We do still get some oil from Venezuela, and so that if Venezuela is put on the list of state sponsors, that connection, that tie would have to be severed because economic sanctions would go into effect. So that may be the reason that Venezuela does not get on the list, even though they do seem to be sponsoring groups, at least in Colombia. So turning to passive sponsorship, again, Byman says that what this category entails is when a group knowingly allows a terrorist group to raise money, enjoy sanctuary, recruit, or basically otherwise flourish without interference from a regime that is not directly aiding the group in itself. And so to qualify as a passive sponsor, really there's 2 qualifications. One, the government can't be directly sponsoring. It can't be an active sponsor of the group. But it also has to allow others within the country to aid the group. Often the support can be given by political parties or wealthy individuals or even other actors with no formal state affiliation. The second qualification is that the government has to have the ability to stop this assistance, but chooses not to do anything or chooses not to develop the capacity to stop it. The 3 examples that Byman tends to focus on in his book is Saudi Arabia turning a blind eye to al-Qaeda, allowing groups to recruit and provide funding to al-Qaeda. Greece's sort of unwillingness to do anything to stop terrorism there, particularly involving the November 17 organization, which really was only stymied when the Olympics were given to Athens, and the US and British basically went in and contributed to counterterrorism there to stop November 17 from operating. He also does cite the United States as a passive sponsor, as I've mentioned, with individuals in the United States providing aid to the PIRA, and the US government knowing about it but not really doing anything to stop it. So one of the last questions I want to leave you with, or one of the last slides, is to talk about some of the pros and cons for states to sponsor terrorism, and also for groups to accept state sponsorship. Starting with from the state perspective, what are some of the pros and cons for the state to provide sponsorship? Well, one of the pros is that it provides states with a way to wage war against adversaries without being implicated. So especially states that are either weaker than their adversaries or that do not want to be implicated in attacks, sponsoring terrorism provides them a way of basically waging war against their enemies without being directly involved. It also does allow states to have some influence over terrorist group activities. The downside of sponsorship is that states can be blamed for the actions of the group, even if the group was acting without knowledge or without the approval of the state. So state attempts to control a group may fail, the group may act without the state's knowledge, but the state can still be blamed because it was a sponsor in the past. Now this is especially true for potential uses of weapons of mass destruction. That a lot of people believe that if a terrorist group obtains weapons of mass destruction, whether it's biological, chemical, or nuclear weapons, that it would receive those weapons from a state. That's really the only way a group could obtain them. And as a result, some people argue that we're not likely to see that kind of terrorist incident because states know that they'll be implicated, that they'll be blamed for the actions of a group if they give those weapons to the group. So that's sort of the con side. Even in terms of conventional terrorist attacks, states often take the blame for the actions of their sponsors. On the group side, the biggest advantages obviously is that it gives you a sugar daddy, basically. It gives you money to operate in ways that you wouldn't otherwise be able to. It also gives you greater legitimacy in terms of recruits and activities. It gives you an ideological base, all the things that we sort of talked about before. But there is a downside for the group as well. You do give up some of your autonomy to the sponsoring state, and so you're more potentially more restrained or more controlled than you otherwise would be. You don't have as much independence to act, and legitimacy can be can go either way. It can be a negative, sort of depending on the type of group and the nature of the sponsor. Some people may see it as a negative that you receive sponsorship from a particular state. On the other hand, some may see it as positive. It just really depends on the nature of the group and the nature of the state sponsor. So if you think of any other pros and cons from either side, I'd love to hear them or see them on D2L in the discussion board. But I'm going to go ahead and finish, wrap this up here. I think that's the extent of what I want to talk about with respect to terror from above. Starting next week, we'll be getting into all the different categories of terror from below. And so as you're doing a rereading, be thinking about our first topic is national separatist groups, and really be thinking about how do national separatist groups differ from the other kinds of groups. Now I know we won't have read a lot about those other kind of groups, but what do you think? What is unique about the national separatist groups? And after we've gone through all of them, we'll go back and see if what you guys were writing about national separatists is correct. So anyway, thanks for listening, and I look forward to your comments on the presentation and also seeing what you have to say about national separatist terrorism. Thanks.